Kamal has been a refreshing new tool in the container deployment landscape, and I want to do a quick demo to highlight its power and simplicity. The intro video from DHH does a great job of showing how to deploy a Rails app with Kamal, but one of the biggest hurdles of doing this is just containerizing your existing Rails app if you haven't already done that. Picking up Kamal along with containerizing your application, whether it's a Rails app or a Symfony app at the same time, can be just a bit of a lift. I'm going to highlight Kamal's overall utility without getting too involved on the Docker and containerization side of things. And really, at the end of the day, if you can containerize your app, then Kamal can deploy it for you. In its simplest form, Kamal is just a wrapper around a bunch of our favorite open source utilities that we already use, and more specifically, a few Docker commands such as build, push, pull, and run for your containers. It's easy to understand, and it allows you to deploy containers as easily as Capistrano. For the Sinatra side of things, we're just going to utilize the demo app from Sinatra's homepage, which just has the /franksays endpoint configured. If we can get franksays rendering on our server, then we can call this a success. While the containerization of the Sinatra app for this isn't going to be perfect, and there's definitely going to be some room for improvement, I just want to emphasize that the focus should be on Kamal and not really the Docker specifics for this. For the containerization part of this, I referenced a great article from Code with Jason that walks you through how to containerize a Sinatra application, and then I added in just a few additional steps to get it working with Kamal. To get things started with Kamal, go ahead and install the Kamal gem and run Kamal init. It looks like I'm running Ruby 3.2.2 right now, but really any modern version of Ruby should work just fine with this. Kamal init is going to go ahead and create a few files for us. The only one we'll deal with for this is going to be the config/deploy.yaml, which you could say is our deploy recipe. And once we open up our config/deploy.yaml file, we'll see that Kamal has actually provided us with a pretty good starting point to getting our application deployed, but there are a few things that we do need to update. The first thing is going to be, we'll go ahead and name our service. This can be whatever you'd like, and this will be used to name your containers and services that Kamal deploys for you. The image setting is going to be the name of the container image when it's pushed to your registry, whether that's Docker Hub, GitHub Container Registry, or anything else. For this example, I'm going to go ahead and utilize GitHub's container registry. I like it because it's closely integrated with the repository. And so you'll notice that I'm fetching my login details from the GitHub CLI command. If you don't have these two values, username and OAuth token, already set, you can go ahead and easily set these from the command line by running GitHub config set with the hostname of GitHub and then username or OAuth token. Next, we can start working on our simple and rough first draft of our Docker file. You should be at the very least just comfortable with the basics of Docker and a Docker file. There's a few additional things you'll want to dig into later with Docker, such as layer caching and multi-stage images to make your images smaller in their final result. Since the focus for this, though, is going to be on Kamal, we just want to get our Sinatra application up and running. This quick and simple approach for our Docker file should work just fine. Within our Docker file, you can see we're building our image based on the Docker Hub Ruby 3.2.2 image. We're going to go ahead and set that working directory. We're going to copy our app into there. Go ahead and install our gems, set the port of 4567 for Sinatra, and then we'll go ahead and run our app at the end with bundle exec rackup. The next thing we'll do is create our Sinatra app, which we'll save as app.rb. All we need in this file is that example from the Sinatra homepage for the /franksays endpoint. When our app is rendering, we should be able to hit /franksays and see, put this in your pipe and smoke it, just in plain text, which is that example from Sinatra's homepage. And then next, we can go ahead and create our gem file so that we can run bundle install to actually install Sinatra, which was one of the steps that we put in our Docker file. We probably could have done this with just a simple gem install within our Docker file instead of dealing with bundler, but it's simple enough to get this added, and it's pretty common flow. So within our gem file, we'll go ahead and add Sinatra in there. And then the last file we'll create is the config.rackup file. This is just a simple configuration file for rack that Puma is going to go ahead and utilize to figure out how to boot our application. And here we just need to require our app and then do a call to run Sinatra application. And with app.rb, config.rackup, and gem file, that's a pretty standard Sinatra setup. It allows us to kind of expand and build more parts of the app in the future. But we probably could have just built this into one simple file that has everything to get our app up and running. Now that we do have our Sinatra application created, we need to tell Kamal where we want to deploy this thing. You'll notice there's a server section within our deploy.yaml. For this example, we're just going to deploy to one server. but you can put multiple hosts in this setting as well. So, but we do need to update the address from the example localhost address. For this, I'm going to go ahead and use DigitalOcean, but really any server that you have SSH access to that either has Docker installed or you have permission to install Docker on it will work just fine. With DigitalOcean, I already have a key configured, so my SSH access is already ready to go once I create this droplet. And we'll go ahead and name this instance Sinatra demo, and then we can grab the newly created IP address and plug it into our deploy.yaml file. It's also important to note you should harden your server by setting up the correct networking rules and upgrade maintenance just to keep everything safe. And at this point, we can try to run Kamal setup. It's going to go ahead and do a few things like ensuring that Docker is installed. It'll install traffic. Traffic's going to be our local proxy for web traffic, and then along with a few other items. Looks like our setup didn't actually work. Easy fix though. I wanted to keep as many of the stumbling blocks in here as possible, and this one should be pretty uncommon, but it's a good way to explain how Kamal expects a Git repository to help with naming your containers. So what's really great about this is the SHA that you see in your Git history and on your repository host, whether that's GitHub or GitLab, is going to match what's actually deployed on the server. This is also really helpful with rollbacks. You can just specify a SHA, rollback, and it'll easily roll back to that previous SHA that you already built and is sitting on your server. Also with correlating what's actually currently on the server, and even just looking at specific image build artifacts if you need to reference something with a specific deploy. With a simple git and init, we can give this another go. And this is, again, just pure user error on my part, but it also highlights that Kamal is going to build your application from your Docker file by default. I made a boo-boo though, and I named it Dockerfile all caps. I was writing a README before this, README all caps, simple fix though. You can also override the Docker file that Kamal is going to use if, for instance, maybe you have, right now you use a Docker file for local development and you just want a Docker file for production specifically. You can set this file so it doesn't always have to use that Docker file. All right, we can go ahead and try to run Kamal setup again. And it looks like it's in the Docker build phase. So while that's completing, I want to go ahead and add in a custom health check for our Sinatra app. I have the documentation pulled up here for defining a custom health check with Kamal. The default is actually going to hit /up on port 3000. But if you recall from our Docker file, we actually have Sinatra booting up on port 4567. And the only endpoint that we actually defined is that /frank says. So we want our health check to go ahead and match that. We'll go ahead and copy this snippet from the documentation. And then we can swap out those details so that our health check will pass properly. And also just a quick note, this is actually a Docker health check. So when you set this up, Kamal is going to configure this as a health check for the Docker container. So later if you run Docker PS on your server, you'll see the health check state actually matches based on this custom health check. And health checks with Kamal do require that curl is installed within your container for it to run. So not on the server, but actually in the container, which means it needs to be installed as part of our Docker file. So let's go ahead and get that added in. And next we'll go ahead and run Kamal setup again. And oops, we forgot to set our gem source for bundlers. So simple fix, let's go ahead and add that in for Ruby gems and we can continue on. And let's try another Kamal setup. Looks like I'm also missing an apt-get update in there within that Docker file. That way it can actually find the curl package. It needs to update all those apt repositories. So simple enough, let's go ahead and add that in and run Kamal setup again. And it looks like we made it through the Docker build. Since you'll see the red build steps are now complete, and we built out our image in about 78 seconds. We can definitely make this faster, but again, I just want to focus on the Kamal bits for this, leave the Docker optimization for another time. We can go ahead and open up where our application will eventually be, which is at IP/Frank says. And we'll see that the server is returning a bad gateway error, which is expected for now. There's actually nowhere to route our request yet because we haven't successfully deployed and our app with Kamal and had traffic actually start to send traffic to this. And looks like our setup failed, which was intentional, but I wanted to also highlight how you can see application level errors coming through with Kamal. So it looks like even though our Docker image built, once you run the server, you can see that Sinatra actually needs Puma installed in there. So let's go ahead and add Puma within our gem file. And then running another Kamal setup, and alas, Puma actually has native extensions that need to be installed, so we also need to add build essential, which will give us all of our C bindings to install that. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and add in no install recommends just to try to reduce the amount of things that app tries to install with our container. And ultimately, you want to make your final container as small as possible. It makes it easier to ship it around and also just nicer to deal with. I've also moved the app steps to the beginning of this, since those won't actually change as often as our gem file will in the future. Our gem file, we're going to add other gems that we need or helper gems or things like that. But on the apt-get side, it's going to be pretty consistent unless we need to install something like maybe the Postgres gem or something else that requires native extensions. And so this should be the last tweak to our Sinatra application to get it live. So let's go ahead and run another Kamal setup and see if our container comes online. I'll refresh on /franksays page, and there we go. Our Sinatra app, just a simple little Ruby app, is deployed on our DigitalOcean droplet via Kamal. And I want to do in another video run through basically all of these steps that you're seeing in the Kamal deploy and just talk through what all of those are doing. Because once you start to look at it, you'll really understand that we're building the image and we're going to go ahead and push it and then run it on our server. There's some other stuff that's happening with traffic for the routing and other things you can do like SSL termination. But at the end of the day, it's talking to those core open source technologies that a lot of us already use. It's just kind of creating this nice CLI for this that doesn't require a bunch of additional setup. So hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.